Hello, and welcome to day 2 of the Festival of Monsters Conference. Woo, yes. Day 3, sorry, what am I saying? This is day 3. We started on Wednesday. I'm a little confused because I'm running everything. So this is panel 5B, Monstrous Transformations. I am your host, Dr. Michael Chemers. I'm the director of the Center for Monster Studies. I'm very happy to see everybody here today. I'm very excited to introduce this panel because this trio, or should I say one entity with 3 heads, has been a regular here at the conference for quite some time, many years. Yeah. What is this, your 3rd year, 4th year? 3rd year, yeah. So we're so happy to have them back. It's always such a pleasure to see people come back to the conference. And so I hope that all of you will come back as well. So I think what I'd like to do is I will introduce them one by one as they present their papers so that you can get to know them individually one by one, and then we'll just jump right into the papers. So here we go. We're going to start with John Edward Martin from the University of North Texas. John is the Director of Scholarly Communication and Comic Studies Librarian, which is so cool, at the University of North Texas Libraries. He's a scholar of early American literature and horror fiction, film, and comics. He's currently working on a book-length study of comic adaptations of the work of Edgar Allan Poe. John Edward Martin.
Thank you. Are we good? Okay. I'm not talking about Poe today, unfortunately, so. There we go. All right. American popular culture is forever young, beautiful, and erotically charged, at least in its own self-conception, or one might say, self-obsession. Our media culture, from the society pages and entertainment magazines to Hollywood and the social media ecosphere, encourage and perpetuate this uncompromising desire for eternal youth, beauty, and sexual potency, often to the point of pathology. As St. Vincent's song Los Ageless from her 2017 album Mass Seduction manifests aurally through its driving electronic drums and synth-based background overlaid by distorted guitar lines and obsessively repeated lyrics. How can anybody have you? How can anybody have you and lose you? How can anybody have you and lose you and not lose their minds too? We hear the artificial and the primal merging toward madness, but also towards monstrosity. Oh my Lord, we really did it now. I'm a monster and you're my sacred cow. The video, too, which you just saw, if you got here early enough, draws on the plasticky aesthetic of 80s-era workout videos, chemical beauty regimens, and cosmetic surgery to convey the physical and psychological torture required to remain ageless. The song and the video offer a dark satire of the culture of beauty, glamour, and youthful image perpetuated by the entertainment industry, centered in Los Angeles, of course, particularly for women. They reveal the artificiality and self-destructive nature of this culture through images of self-mutilation, painful transformation, and ultimately a disintegration of mind and body into a monstrous and distorted facsimile of womanhood, in which, quote, mothers milk their young and girls in cages play their guitars for a faceless, thankless audience, whom the speaker nevertheless longs to connect with. The song ends with an obsessively repeated whisper, which you notably don't see in the video. I guess that's just me, honey. I guess that's how I'm built. I try to tell you I love you, but it comes out all sick. I guess that's just me, honey. I guess that's how I'm built. I try to write you a love song, but it comes out a lament. A more recent expression may be seen in Coralie Fargeat's Academy Award-nominated horror film, The Substance, 2024, which explores the link to which a successful and beautiful but aging film star, Elizabeth Sparkle, played by 90s icon Demi Moore, might go to preserve that agelessness that has empowered her media-centered career and identity. Interestingly, St. Vincent's song and album were produced by Jack Antonoff, the husband of Margaret Qualley, the other star of The Substance, who plays Sue, the idealized and, quote, younger, hotter version of Sparkle. You can see from these stills how the film reflects some of the same themes and even many of the same images and aesthetic as St. Vincent's video. But the similarities are more than skin deep. Moore's Elizabeth Sparkle is, to an almost uncomfortable degree, a reflection of Moore's own trajectory as an iconic Hollywood star, a conscious choice of the director. She wanted an actress who could not only portray but embody the themes of the film, both physically and psychologically, and she relies heavily on the audience's familiarity and comfort level with Moore as a sympathetic, if frequently exploited and critically neglected, movie star and heroine. Moore's real and fictional history are made visually present in the film by the wall-sized portrait of a younger Moore/Sparkle that hangs in the living room of her penthouse apartment overlooking the Los Angeles cityscape. It is a reminder of the peak of her success and popularity that stands in constant judgment of her now faded celebrity. A point also driven home by the opening sequence of the film, which shows her star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame slowly becoming tarnished, faded, and defaced over the years. But it's also a reminder to us, the audience, that we've been witness and participants in this woman's rise and fall, and rise again, given the award nominations received for this film, and are thus implicated in the story to come. That story, in brief, begins with Elizabeth Sparkle's unceremonious firing from her Jane Fonda-like exercise program in favor of what her producer, Harvey, played by a grotesquely vulgar Dennis Quaid, says the audience, and remember who the audience is, demands, a younger, hotter, sexier hostess. Elizabeth overhears him on the phone in the bathroom of all places, mocking and demeaning her physically and professionally as he lays out his plans for her replacement. This is the catalyst for a rapid descent into rage, despair, and self-loathing that leads first to a car accident that lands her in the hospital, and then, at the prompting of a strange-looking young hospital intern, to signing up for a mysterious and illicit drug treatment, the substance, which promises, quote, a younger, more beautiful, more perfect version of yourself, albeit one that you can only inhabit for 7 days at a time before you must switch back to your original body. Don't ask, it's science. In the interest of time and sanity, I won't try to describe or explain the pseudoscience involved in the treatment, except to say that it draws on an established tradition of mad science in the horror tradition, from Frankenstein with its evocations of alchemy and unnatural birth, to Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, which gives the substance its revivifying power and its fluorescent green color, to David Cronenberg's futuristic visions of bodily alteration and transformation, which we'll hear more about shortly. It's enough to say that Elizabeth Sparkle's radically experimental transformation becomes a physically and emotionally nightmarish journey of desire, revenge, and self-destruction, but also, according to the director herself, one of monstrous empowerment, if we can see the dissolution of an artificially created selfhood and the blood-soaked Grand Guignol-style closing sequence, which I'll return to shortly, as empowering in themselves. But I want to suggest that this film is more than just a critique of beauty culture and the entertainment industry, or even an expose of the costs and consequences of that culture, particularly for women, although it is all of these things. It's also, I would argue, a critique of horror culture and its consequences for us as an audience. And by us, I mean those of us who watch the film and those of us who study and respond to horror as a genre, an art form, or an ideological expression. Whether consciously or not, Fargeat's film challenges us to reconsider our own relationship to spectacles of bodily horror, transformation, and dissolution, and what it is we hope to gain from them: redemption, revenge, revelation, understanding. And are any of these things finally possible once we have used up the objects of our fascination? So while I won't try to explain the science or the logic of Elizabeth's transformation, I do want to briefly trace its trajectory so that we can see what each phase brings in terms of both its consequences for her and its implications for us. The first and arguably most important phase is what Fargeat calls the birth scene, although she's admittedly ambivalent about that term, since she feels that the moment is less about procreation or propagation of the self than it is about survival and the liberation of the self from its bodily and social limitations. But first, there must be a painful separation, a traumatic othering, that I want to argue more closely resembles Julia Kristeva's process of abjection, than birth per se. After injecting herself with the substance, Elizabeth undergoes a painful and graphic transformation that includes, among other things, intense spasms, convulsions, a snake-like writhing on the hard tile floor of her previously immaculate bathroom, until finally her back splits open, like a vagina, and a second fully formed adult body emerges from the gaping wound. We then see the scene from the perspective of the new body, lying next to Elizabeth's on the floor, still coated in the afterbirth of her emergence. She rises, walks over to a clouded mirror, and wipes it clean to see her new, younger face and slick, white, seemingly idealized body, that of Coralie on the right here. She examines herself with a particular focus on her breasts and buttocks, those parts of herself that previously drew the harshest scrutiny from both Harvey and herself. When she looks back at her old body on the floor, the new self, soon to be dubbed Sue, first vomits, then proceeds to sew up the wound in Elizabeth's back with a rough twine that leaves it looking very much like the familiar image of Frankenstein's creature. She then feeds it with one of the supplied tubes of paste and leaves it lying on the bathroom floor, discarded and uncovered, at least for now. It is in this first act of discarding, of casting off the old self, that the process of abjection begins. In this moment, Sue, the new self, almost immediately begins to perceive the old self, Elizabeth, as a thing, a corpse, as something to be shunned, hidden, renounced. Because to recognize it as me is to risk a collapse back into their undifferentiated state. As Kristeva writes, quote, "I am in the process of becoming an other at the expense of my own death. During that course in which I become, I give birth to myself amid the violence of sobs, of vomit." Or as Barbara Creed puts it, quote, "The abject threatens life. It must be radically excluded from the place of the living subject, propelled away from the body and deposited on the other side of an imaginary border which separates the self from that which threatens the self." In this case, that imaginary border soon becomes literalized when Sue, disgusted by the sight of Elizabeth's body, constructs a secret room behind the bathroom wall in which to conceal it from view. But as both Kristeva and Creed also point out, while the abject may be hidden, it cannot be destroyed or forever denied, because to do so risks the loss of the very thing that defines us and allows for our survival. That same message is provided more bluntly in the film by the instructions that accompany the substance starter pack, as I'm calling it, and which are repeated several times in the film. Remember, you are one. You cannot escape from yourself. While Sue grows increasingly defiant of the limits placed on her by the 7-day limit on her occupation of the new body, especially after she wins the job at the studio as the face of the new brand, Elizabeth likewise grows resentful and bitter about her drab, unemployed, and increasingly isolated existence. The scene here is kind of an ironic throwback to an earlier scene in the movie in which the house lady, an older woman, is in the background vacuuming the floor. And in that scene, we saw the picture of Elizabeth up on the wall. Here we're seeing the billboard of Sue in the background. And both versions of Sparkle, skipped ahead, there we go. Both versions of Sparkle begin to see the other not as physical embodiments of the same consciousness, but as distinct personas at war with one another and in a struggle to be seen and valued separately. But this inner battle begins to take its toll, particularly on Elizabeth, as Sue's repeated violations of the balance, as they call it, leads to a gradual disintegration of her body, leading to progressively more debilitating and monstrous forms. The special effects crew came up with some affectionate, if telling, nicknames for the stages of transformation that Elizabeth undergoes. First, as the rapidly aging crone, a figure that, of course, evokes one of the classic forms of the witch. And indeed, this particular version of Sparkle takes great glee in preparing and consuming large, repulsive meals in her customized kitchen that leave the house foul and smelling unpleasantly and affect Sue's body the next day. From there, she devolves into an even more repulsive figure, nicknamed Gollum, who experiences debilitating deformities and uncontrolled rages that threaten to expose their unseemly secrets to the neighbors. But while we as an audience may view these transformations with growing horror and repulsion, Fargeat insists that she was interested not just in how Elizabeth Sparkle's body is destroyed by her quest for youth and beauty, but also how it survives, her word. She sees Sparkle's deformed, monstrous self as a psychic and spiritual as well as a physical transformation, but also views its gradual disintegration as a form of liberation from the demands and concerns of the body. She says in a 2024 interview that, quote, "Elizabeth's metamorphosis, while of course hurting her, at the same time gives her strength and freedom. Once she finally doesn't care anymore what she looks like, she can say, I don't give a fuck. I can do whatever I want. I can be rude, I can be gross, I can speak loud. I can be violent. Finally, she can express how she feels inside. It was really important for me to show her expressing all her anger, all the violence that had been imposed on her. Oh. Yeah, there we go. That was the quote. So, of course, much of the violence that we see imposed on both Elizabeth and Sue is mutually inflicted, or rather, self-inflicted. Remember, you are one. As the battle between her two competing personas ultimately results through a series of incidents that really have to be witnessed to be understood, in a kind of double murder, or is it double suicide? But rather than dying, we see one last transformation, this time into a hideous hybrid creature that is overtly, not covertly among the crew, named Monstrous Elisasu, or Elisasu. Depends on how affectionate you're feeling. This amalgamation of Elizabeth, Sue, and an assortment of monstrous deformities, protruding limbs, and seeping orifices resembles the kind of alien horrors imagined by Lovecraft, or previously visualized by filmmakers like John Carpenter and David Cronenberg. We must remember, though, that Fargeat's monster is not an alien entity or an elder god that arrives from out there to invade, infest, or infect a hapless humanity. It is a terrestrial creature, born not just out of one woman's insecurities and anxiety, but out of a whole culture's expectations, obsessions, and exploitations of women's bodies and minds. It is a product of her audience as much as herself. Remember, you are one. You cannot escape yourself. She's lovely, isn't she? In a final tribute to her adoring audience, Monstrous Elisasu proceeds to dress herself up as a perverse facsimile of her former selves, wearing the dress that Harvey selected for her New Year's Eve show and a paper mask of the young Elizabeth. She then takes her place on stage just before the show opens, somehow slipping past all the crew and fellow performers without notice. A hint, perhaps, that what we are witnessing here is a fantasy or a fever dream, rather than a literal performance, if we still had any doubt. The final 10 minutes of the film is an orgy of blood, violence, and perverse hilarity as Monstrous Elisasu delivers a vomit and scream-inducing final performance that is equal parts Black Swan, Elephant Man, and Carrie. Only the victim here is not the tormented performer on the stage, but rather her tormentors, the executives, the producers, the directors, the audience, which is to say, us, the viewers, critics, and fans, as much as those who directly abused and exploited her in her previous incarnations. We are all implicated in this final bloodbath as we sit transfixed, horrified, and screaming, as one man in the audience does, "The monster!" That's all he says, and then they run away. Sorry for this one, this one's gross. But this is not a particularly triumphant ending, despite Fargeat's suggestion that there's something empowering about the unfettered expression of rage and violence that is certainly Elisasu's right at this point. Film critic David Ehrlich similarly tries to find a message of empowerment, or at least relief, in the closing scenes of the film. He writes, quote, "The substance concludes with a clear moral that it makes you want to believe in. There's more beauty in freedom than there is freedom in beauty." Freedom? Really? Fleeing the studio after her ghastly, though admittedly entertaining performance, Elisasu collapses to the pavement, her body exploding into a pile of limbs and organs. What remains of her Elizabeth face crawls under its own power, thing-like, over to her star on the Walk of Fame, where she experiences a final hallucination of herself as the beloved star of her own drama, to the cheers of an adoring audience. The bloody mess is then swept up by a street sweeper the next morning, leaving the cracked and stained star as the final testament of her existence. Freedom, perhaps, but also a final erasure and forgetting, at least within the visual frame of the film. Fargeat and the film have been criticized for exploiting the very mechanisms that she is attempting to expose: our obsession with youth, beauty, and glamour, particularly via Sue, the male gaze and its inherent violence, and the excesses of the body horror genre, including its sadomasochistic appeal to audiences. As I've tried to show, though, the substance ultimately turns all of these destructive pleasures back on their source, us, the audience, by literally figuring us as the ultimate villains of the story and the ones upon whom Elisa Sue's final revenge is taken, even at the cost of her life and even her physical form. But her ultimate revenge, I think, is in denying us the comfort of believing that this tragic performance of monstrous excess somehow liberates us or her from the consequences of our collective guilt. It is in its renunciation of the catharsis and redemption that we expect as our reward for enduring this spectacle of cruelty that the film reveals the true substance of its horror. Thank you.
Ugh.
Sorry. It's only getting better from here.
All right, great. Love it. Our next presenter is my fellow podcaster, Sam Langsdale from Menlo College. She's the Assistant Director of Academic Success at Menlo College. Her research focuses on the cultural politics around representations of gender, sexuality, and race in visual culture. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and in her award-winning book, Searching for Feminist Superheroes, Gender, Sexuality, and Race in Marvel Comics, which just came out last year.
That's right.
That's great.
Thank you.
She's particularly proud of being the co-editor of Monstrous Women in Comics. And her paper is titled The Powers of Horror in Jeff VanderMeer's Annihilation.
Thank you. So a couple disclaimers. One, my baby was kind enough to give me a cold just prior to coming, but I figure because I'm talking about aliens and pregnancy, me being mucusy is like a special effect. Speaking of pregnancy and aliens, I will be making brief mention of sexual violence, and at some point there will be graphic descriptions of pregnancy and birth. So just as a warning. So, I am not pregnant currently, but this time last year, I was. This is us at the Monster Ball last year. And just as we finished our panel last year about Monstrous family and Doom Patrol, we immediately started brainstorming about what we were going to do this year. Something about transformations, shape-shifting, bodies, something, something, something. Christova, something, something, Creed, something, something. And I thought, this is perfect. I'm pregnant. This is like field work, right? There is no more real experience of shape-shifting and transformation that one actually survives, perhaps, than pregnancy. So I'm all for this. The other thing about last year, you'll see that I am dressed as a cute but fairly generic witch. And this is because I just couldn't get my shit together. What I really wanted to do was wear a white t-shirt with a big red blood splatter over my stomach with a pink xenomorph popping out, like John Hurt experiences in his death in Alien, the 1979 film, because what are you going to get out of pregnancy if you can't give people the heebie-jeebies? I really wanted to do this, and I just didn't manage it. But all of this comes together to inform my paper today, despite the fact that I actually love Alien. It's one of the first sci-fi horror films that I saw that I just really got into. I thought I could run a marathon after I saw it. It just really got me hype. I've had a completely different experience with this film now that I have been pregnant and given birth. And in fact, watching it while pregnant actually was deeply annoying, it turns out. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Not necessarily about Alien, the film. I'll do this for a little bit. But what does it mean for us to use alien fictions as a sort of corollary or metaphor for pregnancy, birth, and even motherhood? So a lot of the annoyances that I experienced, I think you can also find articulated in the debates around whether Alien is or isn't a feminist film. I am not going to go into this too much. You can find any number of blogs. There's a lot of university students who get assigned this film in their media classes and then immediately write breathlessly about how they found Ripley to be feminist or not. And of course, there's scholarly literature. So yes, of course, Ellen Ripley, the main character of Alien, is described as a final girl. She survives in the end of a doomed space mission when all of her colleagues are made to be kibble for the aliens. She deals with and overcomes the misogyny of her crewmates. That feels very feminist. They're always saying crap to her about her being a woman, and she ignores them summarily and watches them all die horrible deaths. She's resourceful, she's tough, and of course she has a cat. So it all sounds very feminist. But again, as I watched the film, I started to realize that there's actually just a lot of patriarchal fears being demonstrated, and a lot of these fears seem to be rooted in penetration, fears about impregnation, fears about birth and motherhood. And I really suddenly didn't think that this felt very feminist. If you've not seen Alien, a crew is awoken from their slumber as they're trying to get back home to Earth. They are directed to another planet, and they find basically a whole huge alien warehouse of eggs. As one does in horror films, they stupidly go towards the danger instead of away. And one of the crewmates gets infected, right? An alien thing jumps out of an egg, attaches itself to his face, inserts a long protruding organ down his throat and infects him and keeps him alive so that he can incubate an alien. Eventually, as I mentioned, it pops out of his chest. It looks exactly like a penis if you haven't seen it. It's pink. It has like a little mushroom shape, and it just has teeth. I mean, it's not very creative. So the aliens then run amok on the spaceship and start picking everyone off, Ripley being the exception. And by the end, we get to see the fully realized xenomorph, this big, terrifying, black, slimy, oozing alien, and she and Ripley kind of battle it out to see who lives in the end. The whole thing is essentially, again, the terror is rooted in these kind of fears of being penetrated, the aliens to lay eggs and then, of course, to infect and incubate, as I said, use a long protruding organ to stuff their biological material down the throats of their victims. And then, of course, the birthing scene is one of explosion and this thing coming out. It's slimy, it's gross, there's lots of viscera. The mothers in this film are also very problematic. The xenomorph herself, being a mother, she is sliming, she's oozing, she is a classic vagina dentata. She's literally got the power to castrate the men and to castrate male power. She is realized through a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth, but she also has a very phallic appearance. The H.R. Geiger's design has her like with a kind of long, elongated head. Again, very phallic, and like I said, the baby xenomorph is just a penis. The ship itself, the Nostromo crew is on a ship, and they lovingly call the ship's computer Mother. It turns out, of course, that the ship has been deceiving them. It's been used by the corporation to make the crew believe that they're going home, but they're awoken and then again served up as sacrifices for this alien race. So what looks like a nice, warm, cozy womb at the beginning of the film ends up being a death trap. In fact, Ripley gets so upset with Mother by the end of the film that when she's trying to get answers and Mother won't give them, she screams, "Mother, you bitch," before slamming the computer into little bits. The other thing that I'm going to say that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way as a pregnant and immediately postpartum person was the fact that the entire crew is offered up as bait without their knowledge or consent. And again, because the incubation of the alien species is very penetrative, the whole thing has a rapey feel. And again, this is something that's attested in the scholarly literature as well. Lots of critics talking about how this is a metaphor for rape. I did see one blog where someone, again, I think it's a reasonable leap to make, tried to say that this is actually a positive thing because it would get male audience members to actually experience some empathy, that they would be able to understand because the men in the movie are also raped through penetrative violence. But look, for me, at the end of the day, I think Barbara Creed is spot on when she's describing this film and noting that the problem here is that the terror is rooted, at least in part, because of the feminization of male bodies. There's nothing more horrifying, Alien seems to be telling us, than being penetrated, impregnated, and birthing spawn. So Creed writes, when male bodies become grotesque, they tend to take on characteristics associated with female bodies. In this instance, man's body becomes grotesque because it is capable of being penetrated. So I get the idea that a film could create empathy in a certain kind of audience, but if we're still having to denigrate female bodily experience and femininity in order to do that, I see this as a problematic kind of mechanism. I don't, again, feel like that's very feminist. The one last thing I'll say is that the film ends with the destruction of the other. This is not about alien encounter. It's not about an exchange or negotiation. It's about eradication. And again, famously at the end of the film, Ripley finds herself trapped in a pod with the mother xenomorph and manages to blast her out into space. And I think the word bitch is used at least one more time. So where does that leave us? I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't be using alien stories or horror to process and talk about pregnancy and birth and motherhood. In fact, I really love the idea that we could possibly explore fears and aversions and even misgivings about all of these things through certain types of monster stories. I'm personally not one who's interested in sanitized versions of pregnancy. I have absolutely zero time for stories that rely on women's selflessness or quote unquote natural maternal feelings. None of that for me, thank you very much. So I don't want to go through the rest of this presentation trying to suggest that pregnancy and birth and motherhood are off limits. I think alien stories are actually a really potentially exciting way for us to explore what are totally valid fears, specifically for pregnant people around this experience. But again, as someone who's actually experienced pregnancy, birth, and now just 8 months of motherhood, I didn't find Alien the film nourishing in the vocabulary provided to us by our conference organizers. It just wasn't giving me anything to hold on to. One of the things that I like about Monstrous Women is that while we can investigate them and see, as John did, how society is guilty of and implicated in the sort of monstrous circumstances many women find themselves in, the figures of monstrous women can also become empowering. They can be taken back, they can be occupied. And I don't think that that happens with the film Alien, at least it didn't for me. So then one might ask, where does one find alien fiction that can provide this kind of thing? And I'm going to suggest that Jeff VanderMeer's novel Annihilation is an example of how this kind of horror can be utilized to less misogynist ends. Again, if you've never read Annihilation, I will just quickly tell you that it is the first in his series. It's called his Southern Reach trilogy. It begins by exploring a sort of undisclosed event that turns a natural habitat into a very alien environment. Things start to morph and change, and over the course of several decades, human exhibitions that are sent in to try to understand what's happened all die pretty horrific deaths. Is it an alien invasion? Is it a kind of corruption of the land? You never get to know, but what happens, what blooms in Area X is very alien indeed. And so what I want to talk about today, I think, are the ways that Annihilation provides as a kind of compelling a pathway into reflecting on both the terror and power of experiences like pregnancy and birth. There's, again, a lot of scholarly literature about the ways that VanderMeer's writing in particular demonstrates a Christavan sensibility, specifically in the way that it embraces abjection. So again, the feeling of unease when we are forced into a liminal space, when we encounter that which is not us, but from which we cannot separate ourselves. And that's definitely part of what I'm going to talk about, but I want to concentrate a little bit more on 3 other concepts from Christava's work that help me to make sense of the correlation between annihilation and pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. And I think this is kind of funny because I think we chose different parts of Christava's work, and I think they push against each other, which is Christava's total deal. So I don't feel bad. I don't have to be responsible for the contradictions. It's Christava's fault. Okay, so the first main concept that I want to talk about that I think is visible in Annihilation is what Christava calls poetic language. So according to Danny Cavallero, poetic language is a type of language that overtly subverts mainstream conventions. It's not exclusively peculiar to poetry. It can be found wherever language challenges and reorders the principles of everyday communication and the structures of grammar and syntax, and whenever an artist chooses to experiment with words and images. So this is a pretty wide definition, and I think it's exciting precisely for that reason, because I think you could find a lot of things that might actually constitute poetic language. Another kind of way to understand this, for Christava, poetic language texts are not necessarily written by women, but any text capable of challenging and fragmenting conventional syntax and logic may be considered revolutionary. And the reason there's this distinction is because often poetic language is feminized in patriarchal culture. So again, Christava is saying it doesn't mean that the author is a woman. It means that the type of language or the type of creative expression doesn't follow the sort of rigid patriarchal standards of logic and objectivity. And so this kind of thing is disruptive. And I think VanderMeer's work could very much be described as poetic language, and particularly in Annihilation. He is self-described as a weird fiction writer. I don't even know how to describe weird fiction. It's so weird. Gosh. Let me just say that of VanderMeer's works, there's a whole series about mushrooms, and not like you take them and woo, but like whole cultures and existences made up of hybrid mushroom people and mushroom detectives who can speak to the dead because, you know, mushrooms have mycelium networks that go underground and have information, and like, dude. It's all about hybrid animals. It's all about evolution. It's about space. It's about murderous rabbits. I don't even know what to tell you. A bear called Born. I don't know. It's weird. And this has huge potential because even reading one of these texts, you find yourselves completely unmoored. You cannot make logical sense of it. It's often not teleological in its reading. And so I think it's very poetic according to Christava. In the novel specifically, you're getting this weird combination of scientific language, sparse dialogue, and characters known only by their profession. Why is this? Again, because the alien event happens, Area X blooms, and an expedition is sent in with 4 women. And then again, we only know them by their professions. The main character is called the biologist. So you think that it might be quite dry, it might be quite logical, but amidst all of this are beautiful descriptions of the environment they encounter, really evocative language about intense bodily encounters with the alien. The logic is constantly disrupted by the affective and the ineffable. And this is particularly true when the biologist encounters the alien entity called the crawler. So at some point in the book, they enter a structure. Was it a tower? Is it a tunnel? It doesn't matter. And in it, there's this like big monstrous alien creature who seems to be writing things on a wall. and the biologist eventually actually has a physical encounter with the crawler. The crawler's words are scattered throughout the book, and it's a thing you can find in fan spaces, people trying to make sense of this. What does it mean? What is VanderMeer trying to tell us? So this is actually a passage of the crawler's words. Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner? I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead to share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives, while from the dim lit halls of other places forms that never could be writhe for the impatience of the few who have never seen or been seen. There are no commas. There's no, it's just supposed to go on and on. And again, I think this is a very purposeful choice, and I think it really helps to take us out of that insistence on a kind of logical, teleological reading. So one of the reasons I really like this, what does this do for me, again, as a sort of pregnant person, in this country in particular, and for people like me, a white, highly educated, middle-class woman, pregnancy can be very medicalized. In fact, the language around pregnancy and birth is incredibly sterilized. And again, it's also very, very androcentric. There's lots of studies that are coming out with increasing rapidity suggesting that most of what we know about modern medicine is based on men's experiences alone. It's been conducted by men. And of course, all these standards then we have are assumed to be universally applicable, but they're very gendered. For me, I'm 43, so I went into this thinking like, I'm old. They're like, no, advanced geriatric age, right? Advanced maternal age or geriatric pregnancy. Like, they go to these great lengths to try to not say what the thing is, right? I'm just like, it's okay, I'm cool. I'm in my 40s, just say it, advanced maternal age. So I experiencing all of this, but at the same time, this is not how I understand my experience. Instead, I found much more meaningful conversations in books like Angela Garb's Like a Mother, A Feminist Journey Through the Science and Culture of Pregnancy. She talks a lot about the studies that are available to us, about the science that we think we know about pregnancy and birth, and interjects her own experiences. Like when she was actually notified that she was pregnant, she'd been out the night before drinking heavily and not knowing she was pregnant. And so she talks about how she spends a whole day wondering if she had just pickled her fetus. I love this. It's funny. It's rude. It disrupts this idea that this is all about medicine and science. It's not. It's about people. It's about lived experience. It's about bodies. So these kinds of things I find very fertile and fruitful in Annihilation. Another thing that I think is very observable in Annihilation is Kristofa's concept of the subject and process. So this is a quote that was in Cavallero. Kristofa says, all identities are unstable. The identity of linguistic signs, the identity of meaning, and as a result, the identity of the speaker. And in order to take account of this destabilization of meaning and of the subject, I thought the terms subject and process would be appropriate. Process in the sense of process, but also in the sense of a legal proceeding, where the subject is committed to trial because our identities in life are constantly called into question, brought to trial, overruled. The biologist, the main character of Annihilation, is constantly undergoing change and evolution throughout the course of the narrative. When I taught this book, the students loved to point out that she's an unreliable narrator. So you're constantly judging her as a reader. Like, is this true? Is it a fever dream? Did she just inhale more spores? What's happening? But you also see her kind of move away from a kind of normative human subject into something else entirely. And again, as the novel goes on, we also find out that one of her motivations for going into Area X as a part of this expedition is that she was a part of a failed marriage. And so again, this added layer of judgment comes into things. What is this person's, sort of nihilist and inspiration? Why was she such a bad wife? Why are her feelings so cold and strange? And all of that, I think, is kind of wrapped up in VanderMeer's, again, his attempt to get us to recognize the sort of constant change and shift of identity. And then also, again, a little like John was saying, that we have to kind of implicate ourselves in how we are also constantly putting people on trial, that subjectivity is a judged process. It does not happen in a vacuum. Again, found this very helpful because pregnant people change and literally expand over the months. The identity of a pregnancy person continuously unfolds and changes. And of course, because this is patriarchy, we are also constantly subjected to intense scrutiny and judgment. This happens in the medical environment. There are constant blood tests to see if you're a bad mother and are you doing drugs of some kind. Your insurance will drop you like a hot rock if you come up with any kind of substance in your blood tests. People who think they're being kind pass you on the street and shout out what they think the gender of your unborn fetus is. God forbid, it never happened to me, but someone tries to touch you because you are pregnant. And all of this is because a pregnant body is one that is under scrutiny. It's constantly on trial, right? Because people think they can see inside. They want to know. It's something that they have access to. Absolute garbage. But it made me relate to the biologist in this way. Now, these two concepts, poetic language and the subject and process, I think come together most powerfully in Kristova's essay, Stabat Mater. What you see here are just a couple screenshots of the essay. So it starts out as a very typical academic essay that's looking at sort of normative patriarchal depictions of the Virgin Mary and how the figure has been used politically to uphold patriarchal power. And then at some point, a different kind of essay erupts onto the page. So on the bottom left side, you see this in bold. Something else comes into the frame. And it turns out, I don't know for sure, that it's Kristova's own musings about her experience of pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. And at no point are you ever told how to read this essay. How do you decide when to switch back and forth? Do you read all the academic stuff first and then you go back to the personal essay? Do you try to skip back and forth? It unmoors you. It stops you, again, as a reader from being able to just go through this in a sort of typically logical fashion. And it combines, again, what's supposed to be this legitimate, objective kind of discourse with bodily, personal sensation. The other thing about Stabat Mater is that it's very honest about combining pleasure and pain. Pregnancy is about both. Just as this essay is both an academic exegesis and a personal reflection, pregnancy, birth, and maternity are about pleasure and pain, terror and awe. What Adrienne Rich talked about in terms of anger and tenderness. There's a constant negotiation between experiences and identities in Stabat Mater. And then the final thing that I think is really important about this essay is the irreducibility of two-ness into one. Kristova goes to kind of great lengths to talk about being a pregnant person, and you are both a person and this other. These things coexist. Mother and fetus or baby, they're not entirely distinct nor separable, but they're not collapsible either. And I think, again, several passages read very much like Stabat Mater in Annihilation, and again, specifically around the figure of the crawler, and then in terms of the biologist's experience when she runs into the crawler. So this is the biologist describing what happened after she had a physical encounter with the crawler. The enormity of this experience combined with the heartbeat and the crescendo of sound from its ceaseless writing to fill me up until I had no room left. This moment, which I might have been waiting for my entire life, all unknowing, this moment of an encounter with the most beautiful, the most terrible thing I might ever experience, was beyond me. Here again, the biologist says, a raging waterfall crashed down on my mind, but the water was comprised of fingers, 100 fingers, probing and pressing down into the skin of my neck and then punching up through the bone of the back of my skull and into my brain. And then the pressure eased, even though the impression of unlimited force did not let up. And for a long time, still drowning, an icy calm came over me, and through the calm bled a kind of monumental blue-green light. I smelled a burning inside my own head, and there came a moment when I screamed. my skull crushed to dust and reassembled mote by mote. I'm sure this is not true for everybody, but holy cow, this sounds a lot like my birth. I pushed for something like 6 hours. I totally had an epidural. So what I remember is intense pressure. I don't know how to describe it other than some kind of wild, wild pressure. I pushed and pushed and pushed, and at some point there was some nurse that came in and was like, "Don't push with your face." And I remember just thinking, what the fuck? What? I'm trying to push with every single muscle in my body. I don't know which one's moving or not. It's fine. I puked. I hate puking. I don't ever vomit, even if it's good for me to do that. And I puked so many times, and I was so pissed because I'd worked so hard to hydrate. They tell you have to hydrate. You're going to be working so hard for so many hours. And at some point, the doctor comes in and very calmly says to me, "Well, you are fully dilated. Good job. And your baby has descended to the right point, but unfortunately, after 6 hours of pushing, his heart rate has now become too variable for us to feel comfortable. We'd like to offer you alternatives." What? What? I can't, there's beeping. Get the frickin' blood pressure cuff off of me. Why do I have so many cords on me? I don't understand what you just said. And my doula is trying to say, "It's okay. Do you need a moment? Do you need a moment?" Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. And they step out, and some point they come back, and I said, "Yeah, okay, I don't know, intervention." Turns out forceps were the answer. Who uses forceps out of the Middle Ages? We do. We do, apparently. And so my baby, after 6 hours of pushing, was fished out with oversized salad tongs. And he plopped onto my stomach, and he was slimy, and I don't even remember a whole lot of anything. He wasn't crying. And later, when I looked at the documentation, it said that he was gray and unresponsive. And reading those words traumatized me more than the moment that he arrived on my chest. And they whisked him away, and they fished the stuff out of his throat, and he finally started to cry. And they brought him back, and I burst into tears, because I was so tired, and it was so hard, and I think I was scared, but also now there was this thing. He had been me, he was me, but he wasn't, and now there he was. I can't think of how to describe this in a way that isn't weird, isn't effective, isn't ringing in your ears. And I love Annihilation for this reason. But am I comparing apples to oranges? Is it reasonable for me to say, hey, this book, which I think is beautiful poetic writing, is better than a film? Well, okay. So let me just briefly talk about the film Annihilation, which is not a direct adaptation. It's more of an inspired film by the book. It has very alien-esque elements. People get exploded just like in Alien. This is Ventress. She basically liquefies in the end. I don't mind this. This is what breastfeeding is, okay? All of your bones liquefy to feed your baby, but it still has a very blockbustery feel. There's things that this film does that I think take away from the book that still convey the same kinds of Chris Daven attributes. People don't overall die that kind of explodey death. They evolve, they change, they are subjects in process. This is a scene where one of the expedition wanders off into the field, and we don't see her again. Instead, what we see are topiaries that are in the shape of human beings, and we're also told at some point that they have human DNA. She seems to literally fuse with, morph with, become something else. This is more horrific, but it's the same idea. A creature attacks one of the expedition. She seems like she's dragged away, and later in the film, it comes back and screams with her voice, and it seems to have this human skull embedded in the side of its face. So again, it's not the annihilation of the one, it's a kind of different, an evolution, a becoming of something else. The film ends with Lena is the biologist encountering the alien other. It's not the crawler. They've gone something more simple. It's the kind of gothic trope of the double. it ingests some of Lena's blood and creates this sort of doppelganger, and she wrestles with it for a long time before she eventually realizes that it's simply mirroring her. It's not trying to kill her. It just is her, but it isn't her. Again, for me, I think this is pretty resonant. This is my baby trying to give me kisses, but what he's done is stuck onto my cheek like a plecostomus fish. What he's doing is just copying me. And again, it's just this very strange sensation because it's slimy, it's actually a little painful, he's got brand new teeth. But in fact, what I kind of experience in this moment is a both me and a not me. The copying of me is something that's separate from, but also intimately tied up with me. So I will just end by saying the conclusion of the film, Lena and her husband seem like they die, but they don't. They evolve, they become something different. And what I love about this and what I think is very Kristaven is that there's a focus on shifting, changing, not being fixable. It's not the annihilation of the self or the other as it is in Alien. Instead, it's a sort of evolution of fluidity of existence. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. Our final speaker this morning is Spencer D.C. Keralis from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Spencer is the head of Digital Scholarship Services and co-director of the Center for Digital and Public Humanities at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Their scholarship explores the intersections of book history, media archaeology, and digital humanities, and has appeared in Book History, Hyper-Riz, or Rise, is it Hyper-Rise?
Hyper-Rise.
Hyper-Rise, as in rhizome. And American periodicals, DH plus BH, an interdisciplinary collection on digital humanities and book history, co-edited with Kate Coker, is forthcoming in the Illinois Open Publishing Network. And their paper title is Metastatic Masculinity, Penetrating the Male Body in Crimes of the Future. Spencer.
Thanks, Michael. In 2024, a team of Chinese scientists published a paper in the journal eBiomedicine titled Association of Mixed Exposure to Microplastics with Sperm Dysfunction, a multi-site study in China, in which they published findings from a cross-sectional study involving 113 male participants from 3 regions in China. In semen and urine samples from these men, the scientists used Raman spectrometry, Raman microscopy, a spectroscopic technique typically used to provide a structural fingerprint by which molecules can be identified, to detect 8 types of microplastics: polystyrene, polypropylene, polycarbonate, polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride, polytetrafluoroethylene, polyethylene terephthalate, and acrylon nitrile butadiene styrene. Little tone poem there for you. According to their findings, quote, microplastics were detected in all semen and urine samples, with participants typically exposed to 3 to 5 different types. While the long-term effects of this exposure remain unknown, the team observed that participants exposed to polytetrafluoroethylene, a coating used in nonstick pans, showed significant reductions in total sperm count, sperm concentration, and progressive motility, the ability of the little swimmers to get where they want to go. And that exposure to additional types of microplastics increased the negative effects on overall semen quality. While the scientists did not elucidate the mechanisms underlying the adverse effects of microplastics on male fertility and did not speculate about the potential, quote, cross-generational effects of such exposure, their findings highlight, and this is a quote, the potential reproductive health risks posed by microplastic contamination. And remember, no participant in the study was free from microplastic contamination. Given the ubiquity of microplastics in the environment inhabited by humans and other animals, it is the potential for cross-generational effects that is most suggestive in the present context. The notion that microplastics and other environmental contaminants could provoke an evolutionary response, natural selection in humans and other animals, an adaptation that alters humans at the genetic level, remains for now in the realm of science fiction. Or does it? It's well documented that humans can be genetically predisposed to certain kinds of cancer, many of which were likely triggered by environmental effects. The difference, of course, is that we typically think of natural selection as producing favorable adaptations that allow the species to propagate and survive in changing environments. But the truth is that most mutations caused by natural selection do not result in survival. The tree of life is littered with evolutionary cul-de-sacs from which no creature emerged alive. Mutations like cancer, in which cells change and grow in a way that is ultimately inimical to the organism, are fundamentally maladaptive. Given that preliminary study indicates the potential for a negative effect on reproductive capacity from exposure to microplastics, suggests that this environmental stimulus is not one that will produce a survival response in the species. However, in the midst of global climate crisis, genocidal war, growing distrust of life-saving medical science, and escalating race and class hostility, microplastics have to get in line. They're pretty far down the food chain of the things that will likely end our species. However, they might change our physiology in the meantime. In the 2022 film Crimes of the Future, David Cronenberg imagines a near future in which humans are struggling to adapt to a rapidly collapsing environment. The film opens with an image of a child playing on the seashore, littered with the detritus of pollution and shipwreck. Juna, his mother, calls to him from the veranda of their cottage, warning him not to eat anything he finds on the shore. This is momentarily perplexing until we see the boy Brecken in the bathroom preparing for bed. He sits on the floor and begins to happily eat the plastic trash bin next to the toilet. His mother sees him and recoils and later smothers him in his sleep with a pillow. After this horrific act of maternal infanticide, Juna leaves a message for the boy's father. I want you to tell Lang, who's played by Scott Speedman, that if he's interested in picking up the corpse of that creature he calls his son, the Brecken thing, tell him to come to the address I gave you. It will be here and I won't be. Brecken is the product of accelerated evolution syndrome, a widespread phenomenon in the world of the film, which a group of radical evolutionists led by his father Lang attempt to exploit in order to adapt to their collapsing environment. Subsisting on bars of plastic waste, they are evolutionary accelerationists, existing on the fringes of society and hunted by bureaucrats who seek to police the deteriorating borders of the human. Brecken's birth demonstrates the success of their radical evolutionary project, embodying the cross-generational effects of subsisting on plastic waste. As Brecken's mother's violent response suggests, these changes are not welcome in their society. Rather than seeing her child as a next successful phase in human development, Juna sees him as inhuman, monstrous, irreconcilably other, and chooses to kill him rather than to raise a monster. Not all of the effects of accelerated evolution syndrome are as potentially constructive as Brecken's adaptation. While mutation has caused a variety of biological changes in humans, including a reduction in pain receptors and resistance to infectious disease, these are counterbalanced by a propensity to produce cancerous growths. Surgery has become casualized in this society. With minimal pain and no risk of infection, anyone can perform surgery in almost any context. Aging performance artist Saul Tenser, played by Viggo Mortensen, takes advantage of his body's propensity to produce novel organs, growths that develop unique functions like hormone production, participating with his partner Caprice, played by Léa Seydoux, in performances in which they remove the neo-organs his body spontaneously produces before live audiences to great acclaim. The effects of these organs on Tenser's body, however, is not positive. At the beginning of the film, we see him struggling, visibly in pain and in respiratory distress, as his biomechanical orchid bed and breakfaster chair awkwardly manipulate his body. The hormones his latest neo-organ produces have thrown the machines out of whack. They no longer recognize his pattern. It's not anticipating my pain, Tenser complains of the bed. Perhaps contrary to Barbara Creed's assertion that the male body becomes grotesque because it is capable of being penetrated, as Sam shared, the fraught interface between Tenser's body and the machines is portrayed as beautiful. One of the technicians summoned to recalibrate the machines enthuses, "This bed loves your body, Mr. Tenser. It is so flexible, so attuned to every shift of your pain centers. It's a beautiful thing to behold." Further, Tenser and Caprice have turned the penetration of Tenser's body into art. In their performances, they use a machine designed for performing autopsies, the Sark autopsy module, to remove the neo-organs his body spontaneously produces before live audiences. The machine, a chitinous sarcophagus, is described by the fangirling technicians. The Sark autopsy module was one of the best units we ever made. It's gorgeous. They're legendary, so complex, so subtle. The past tense here is telling. This machine, for all its elegance, like Tenser himself, is, like Tenser himself, something of a relic. When Caprice tells Tenser that there is a new hormone in his bloodstream indicating a fresh-grown neo-organ, he responds with relief. Great. It's about time. I thought I was all tapped out, dried up. You always think that, and you're always wrong, Caprice admonishes him. Tenser replies, one day I'll be right. The use of an apparatus for manipulating the dead to make art from novel tissues that are slowly killing the artist is typologically apt to represent the bleak, decadent society Cronenberg creates. This is a culture that is resigned to its own slow death. When Tenser and Caprice visit the secretive National Organ Registry, a branch of the New Vice Unit, to officially record the novel organ, they encounter bureaucrats Whippet and Timlin, who alternately fetishize and passively condemn the evolutionary burst that Tenser represents. The agency exists to maintain restrictions on human evolution by documenting and preserving newly evolved organs. Timlin, played by Kristen Stewart, is visibly aroused during her examination of Tenser, breathlessly probing his body to get a better view of the new structure his body conceals. In mathematics, Tenser's name is an algebraic object, which in one context describes the stress experienced by a material at a given point. In our glimpses of his day-to-day life, we see Tenser's body subjected to various stresses. In the biomechanical orchid bed, the feeding chair, under the voyeuristic scopes of the organ registry bureaucrats, and subject to Caprice's ministrations in the autopsy device, his body is rendered malleable, penetrable, and plastic. Mortensen was in his early 60s at the time of filming, and his body, though still reasonably fit, is no longer the sinewy hypermasculine machine that Cronenberg displayed in Eastern Promises. Softer and more malleable, manipulated both by machines and by devices wielded by Timlin and Caprice, his body is feminized both by age and by its penetrability. His body has also become a kind of womb for the neo-organs, and the intersection, I think, between womb and sarcophagus here is not insignificant. Though it's clear that he's producing, his propensity for producing these organs is slowly killing him. In her virtuoso 1978 essay, Illness as Metaphor, Susan Sontag traces the history of the metaphors that frame cancer and tuberculosis, not to valorize these metaphors, but to propose a strategy for resisting them. In particular, Sontag resists the notion that disease is a result of or a reflection of the morals of the afflicted person. The romantic idea that the disease expresses the character is inevitably extended to assert that the character causes the disease, because it has not expressed itself. Passion moves inward, striking and blighting the deepest cellular recesses. that the cutting and probing of Tenser's body has replaced reproductive sex for Tenser, Caprice, and Timlin is a measure of the decadence of this collapsing society. That the women use optical probes to view the interior recesses of Tenser's body renders this interaction as voyeurism. Caprice's simulated cunnilingus on a zippered fistula installed in Tenser's abdomen is the closest we see to conventional sexuality, though Tenser's passivity, like a cannulated cow, renders this sexual act masturbatory rather than consummate. As Timlin breathlessly observes after one of Tenser's performances, surgery is the new sex. Through Tenser's passive abjection and the women's eager but cool manipulation of his body, Cronenberg presents a vision of erotic transformation through the abject, where the penetrability and mutability of the male body becomes a site of transformation, challenging conventional understandings of gender and sexuality. And here we see Timlin doing what she does. In both the scientific study I cited at the beginning and in Cronenberg's film, we see a bias that Sam also mentioned that is typical of medical research. The effects of environmental change on men are foregrounded and women are either ancillary or absent. If microplastics have a potential impact on semen, how much more damage must they be doing to women's reproductive capacity? If Tenser's body is producing new organs rather than reproducing via what he describes as the old sex, what is the state of Timlin and Caprice's anatomy? We don't know. Juna appears solely as a receptacle for Lang's adaptive seed and commits infanticide as a result. This vision of the future is bleak, giving rise in the characters to a profound resignation. In the society where cutting and probing has supplanted reproductive sex, and in which surgery is easily accessed and deprofessionalized, the aestheticization of mutation and plastic alteration of the human body creates a decadent and despairing milieu for the film. The transformation worked on the bodies of the artists, like those naturally occurring in the humans with accelerated evolution syndrome, are largely maladaptive. Replacing sense organs with ears would not help one survive in the wild any more than Tenser's novel organs, which distort and disrupt his body's systems. Rather, though, than being actively nihilistic, this is an aesthetic of resignation, reveling in the beauty of evolutionary failure, an aesthetic of impermanence, the necro-aesthetic of a doomed species dwelling in a collapsing environment on a dying planet. The true nihilism, the true monstrosity in this film, dwells in the operations of the state, which relies on maintaining the decline of humanity to remain in power. Brecken's adaptive transformation is hidden when his autopsy is falsified, and Lang is killed to hide the success of his evolutionary accelerationist project. Only maladaptive transformations like Tenser's malignancies can be countenanced by the regulatory bureaucracy. Grieving for the deaths of Lang and Brecken, at the end of the film, Tenser ingests a bar of plastic waste, an act that is as likely to kill him as it is to accelerate his evolution. Under the watchful eye of Caprice's ever-present camera, Tenser smiles in resignation and sheds a final tear. Tenser represents a genetic cul-de-sac destined to reproduce only through his art. The hope for humanity embodied by Lang and Brecken has been terminated and discredited. For among the titular crimes of the future, the unforgivable crime is to evolutionarily transcend the human, moving beyond this doomed species to embody something new. As Nietzsche suggested, that which does not kill us has the potential to make us better, to make us stronger. But in Cronenberg's vision of a depleted, decadent future, change for the better is the one thing that we as a species cannot tolerate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Spencer. Well, congratulations once again to the three of you, in this case for creating the grossest panel that has ever been shown at the Center for Monster Studies Festival of Monsters. So I want to congratulate you, and I think you deserve a trophy.
That just reads like a challenge, Michael.
I thought you would take it as one. So we have a few minutes for questions, comments, fatal riddles, stories. We've got 15 minutes. Blake.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentations. They were all very incredible and compelling. The question that I had was for John. One thing that strikes me about the substance is the treatment of food in the substance as something like not only related to the title of the film, but also just so many instances where food is presented as something that is disgusting. A good example would be like Elizabeth later in the film, as you say, in the crone stage, where she's like cooking these kind of gross meals. Her meeting with Harvey, where like Harvey is like dipping shrimp in this gross butter sauce and like basically rubbing it on his face. There's the still of the Chardonnay with the fly in it, and how that is kind of like a meditative scene. My question is how food and consumption relates to a large part of what makes Elizabeth monstrous. The notion that somebody like her is being consumed by the viewing public, right, and how not wanting to be fully digested is that boundary, if we think of Cohen in his writing, that is being crossed, that she does not want to be fully consumed, but wants to be chewed on forever, to be enjoyed, a meal that never ends. And how that creates a sort of tension with how we might want Elizabeth to be loved as an aging woman, but also the unrealistic quality of only being able to enjoy one thing for all time. That the cycle of renewal, the digestion cycle, if you might want to call it that, has to keep happening while the issue still kind of therein lies. One other scene I wanted to kind of reference was how you brought the still of Elizabeth's kind of splattered face on her star, and how that mirrors the cheeseburger in the earlier part of the film being dropped as like as a sort of, again, food is something that is maybe just as abject as the kind of sexual natural imagery that is going on as well. So I was curious as to what you thought in terms of how food just in general and the notion of digestion and consumption is playing out in that film, and how it might tie to the conclusion of returning to that spot of the gross ketchup cheeseburger, right, kind of disintegrating into that star.
Right. First of all, you're welcome for me not putting a GIF of Dennis Quaid eating the shrimp, because that was far more foul than anything we saw up here. I mean, I feel like you just elaborated most of a possible answer there, but I think you're right that food becomes yet another of these sort of metaphors that Elizabeth and Sue. It's another sort of place where they're kind of at war with one another, right? The food becomes both a symbol of how they are being consumed by the public, by the audience, by the industry itself. I mean, they look like candy in the beginning with their little outfits with the bright colors, and very similar to the music video. It both looks like you could eat it, and it also looks like it might poison you, right? It has both those qualities. All of those food scenes where she is in the kitchen, she gets her parting gift from Harvey when she leaves the show is a French cookbook, but all the recipes are really disgusting. They're really foul, and it includes words like crushing, beheading, like gutting, like these really kind of violent terms for how you're supposed to prepare the food. And she starts doing this while she's in her witch-like crone state. But the purpose of it is partly to satisfy her own appetite, her own desire that she's sort of repressed all of this time. But it also sort of serves the purpose of striking back at Sue. Because when Sue is performing on stage in her outfit, she starts feeling, the effects of eating all that foul food. So it's another weapon to be used against herself, essentially. But yeah, some of those images that you mentioned, especially in the very beginning when we're seeing the installation of the star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. At first, people treat it very carefully and honorably, and they take pictures and they polish it. But over time, it starts to become this object of just disregard, and people spill their drinks and their food and their gross stuff, and they just kind of walk over it, and it just becomes fouled by the whole experience. And then at the end, we see Elisa Sue herself become part of that waste, right? She is the splatter on the star that eventually just gets swept up. So yeah, I mean, I think all of that is there was way too much in terms of imagery for me to wrestle with in this particular presentation, but I think all of that is relevant because it is, again, about consumption and about appetite and about this sort of push and pull between wanting to be seen and recognized and appreciated and consumed, but also not to be used up, right? And she is, that is happening to her in both her incarnations. She is food for the public, and she won't last forever, even though she tries very hard to do that. So yeah, it's all of that. I think it could be another paper on food in this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. I think Harold, I saw your hand first.
Again, thank you all for the presentations today. One of the things that I'm really kind of interested, especially coming out of Spencer's paper, all of you have dealt with body horror and abjection and revulsion, but I'm also really interested in some of the themes I'm noticing from your papers on the desirability of that body horror and how that want and desire becomes expressed through the revolting parts of those transformations. I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit about where you see that desirable body horror coming out in your particular projects.
So I think as with a lot of Cronenberg's films, the body is always a scene of both desire and revulsion. And I mean, when you really look up close at it, fucking is gross, right? It's squishy and it makes weird noises and there's parts going into other parts and you're putting things in your mouth that you wouldn't normally think to do that, So I think that is actually just zooming in or pulling putting that kind of big fisheye lens on the stuff that our bodies do. I mean, that's kind of the root of abjection in Kristeva's in Powers of Horror, is that the stuff our bodies do, and when we become essentialized to those functions, whether it's vomit or shit or menstrual blood or birth, then it becomes it has a negative affect that she calls abjection. So I think that any of our functions, whether it's eating, as our first questioner alluded to, or fucking, or giving birth, or going to the bathroom, all of those things, when we zoom in on them, are horrifying. And so desire itself, appetite itself, becomes a locus of both horror and want in especially in Cronenberg. I think Cronenberg has made a fine art out of this over the last 40 years. So and I think Crimes of the Future, it's hard to describe the plot because there isn't much of one, but it's kind of an aesthetic meditation on this collapse and on the collapse of desire, the collapse of the erotic, and if you watched Star Trek Discovery, Cronenberg has a bit part on that, a walk-on part on that, and he is increasingly frail. He is not a young man anymore, and I think that Crimes of the Future is his sort of meditation on that and the aestheticization of his own decline.
Thanks. Great. I see. I'll go around this way.
Thank you all for your presentations. This was such a fun panel. I have a question primarily, I think, for Spencer, but also perhaps for John and Sam, and that is about Kafka. Crimes of the Future strikes me almost as a retelling or a reimagining of a hunger artist. And then that gif of the orchid chair looking somewhat like a carapace. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could elucidate for me any through lines or connections you see there between a Kafkaesque imagining of suffering as intentional art.
So I will defer to anyone who has read that in the last 30 years, because I have not. Not since undergrad. So I do think that Cronenberg is participating in a long tradition of sort of dystopian imaginings of especially bureaucratic society, and I think that could be one connection to Kafka, because in the Kafka that I recall, I'm an Americanist, so I didn't dip into Kafka much, but it is often bureaucracy that is dehumanizing, and the bureaucracy of modernity in particular. What we have in Cronenberg is the bureaucracy of postmodernity and of a potential for post-human bureaucracy. So maybe there's something there, but I'm not familiar enough with Kafka to answer that lucidly.
Anybody else on Kafka? No?
Same. I think I read The Metamorphosis in grad school 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So I don't have a whole lot of direct Kafka connections to make, although I can, I guess, feel that.
Okay.
All Americanist too, so forget us.
All right. So we got some reading to do, Avalon. Thank you. Joe.
Hi. So yeah, John and I were talking a little bit about the substance yesterday, and I'm really compelled by your reading, even though I'm sort of invested in like Sam's kind of poetic language and objection, and the kind of liberation of Elisa Sue as a kind of, I'm thinking about psychobiddies and this kind of thing of like non-naturalistic monstrosity. But I'm so compelled by your idea of the audience being implicated as kind of horror viewer. And that seemed to intersect with your, Spencer, in terms of audiences and both of them watching this sort of body horror. And I'm wondering, like, there seems to be double audiences in both of them. Like, there's the showgirls, or who are also watching, who are kind of seeing themselves in Eliza Sue, and maybe have a different modality of seeing or watching that's more sympathetic. And then there's the revolutionary audience in Crimes of the Future that I don't know if that's sardonic, really. I think there's a way in which they maybe represent a more utopian horizon for this sort of evolution of plastic matter. And then another overlap I saw with Sam's and John's talks is the kind of Lovecraftian, and I wonder if there's a sort of feminist way that the Lovecraftian other is being recuperated in the way that we see in sort of anti-racist horror right now, like Lovecraft's Country and The Ballad of Black Tom and all these kinds of things of that there's, and why that's happening now, if that's happening,
Do you want to say anything, or you want me to say something?
Well, I'll just briefly say that I think, I know I've kind of crammed a lot into my space, but I think I started by trying to say that I wanted to just demonstrate how Annihilation was far less, certainly the novel, I would say far less, if not at all, misogynist. I do think there's a possibility of actually performing a feminist reading of it, but like that is way more spoons than I have available right at the moment. But I think that that's a really good point. And I think, yes, I mean, I think that there's something to be said for this being a really natural progression. I mean, if we are using these theoretical lenses that are very much open to sort of spilling over fluidity, unknowability, then like, yes, of course, like Lovecraft Country is the right place for that kind of exploration. So, and in terms of like why now, I don't know. I was thinking about it in terms of the keynote yesterday. Like, I honestly think we're just kind of in another sort of crest of a wave. I think we could probably trace various points in literature and popular culture previously where you can see this sort of surge of women exploring horror for particular ends. And I think it's happening again. And I'm very compelled by the argument that this is in part like a kind of cathartic process, that it's a safer way to explore the extreme violence that we are subjected to on a constant basis. And so there's some agency in being able to take that experience and render it through horror and fantasy. Thank you.
Yeah, and when I was listening to your paper yesterday, obviously I was thinking about the connections there, and I did feel like the reading that you were offering of Baby Jane, and then you also showed a little brief still of the substance. I thought, oh, there's the connection, and I feel like your reading of that is similar to Fargeat's reading of her own film, and I don't see that as incompatible. But I think, as you said, it has to do with which perspective you're taking. Which audience are we talking about? Because obviously there is an audience figured in the film, and it is, to a large extent, the audience that has victimized her throughout her career. And that's who she's most immediately taking her revenge on, and they deserve it. But then on some level, so do we. And I think that's where I kind of got interested, is there are other audiences, including those of us in this room who are fans, who are scholars, who are critics, who love horror in various ways. And I think we have this impulse to want to find something redemptive or the catharsis or the, and it's there. I think we can all sort of agree that we can find that in these films, but it interested me, especially as I was reading more and more about body horror. What are our expectations? Why are we interested in this? Why do we keep coming back to this? Why do we want to find something, that we can claim out of this? And I feel like this film is partly making use of that and also partly mocking that. The fact that we think we're going to watch this movie and it's going to somehow, in some way, our beloved icon, Demi Moore, is going to win, right? She's going to find a way to make this a redemptive story. And I think you could read it that way, but you can also read it as a tragic story. Kind of like, and the reason I framed it with St. Vincent is that it also has that little promise in the whisper that doesn't appear in the video. Interestingly, it's in the song, where she says, "I wanted to tell you I loved you, but it came out all," what did she say? All sick. "I wanted to write you a love song, but it came out a lament." Right? So it's like both of those things are happening at once. She's trying to do one thing, but also maybe not accomplishing that. But I agree, it depends on the audience. There's a great article, and I didn't get it in here, about the butt shot and how this film makes use of that and attempts maybe to try to redeem that somehow, and at the same time it exploits it over and over and over and over. Even in that final scene where, you, like you said, you see the other dancers, we never see their faces really. The camera is down here at butt level, and we mostly see them from behind. They're anonymous figures, right? So yeah, they're an audience, and maybe their perspective is very different from the audience, but we don't see that. We see what the audience that's getting splattered with blood is seeing, right? And maybe that's the point, is that's what we're supposed to see. So yeah.
On that note of getting what we deserve, I'm sorry, we are out of time. So another big, huge thank you to John, Sam, and Spencer. Thank you so much, you guys. Okay, don't forget, I think there's still some food and coffee out there. Please eat it.
Please.
We paid for it, so.